because I'd had that experience as a student living away from home and understanding how having that community can really make the difference in how you feel good about where you are and you're integrated. I kind of created that experience for people coming in from outside of Montreal. And that business model actually worked so well that it turned into like my early property management, because I had this way of optimizing buildings in a bad part of town, bringing in good tenants and renting for almost double market value, because I created this kind of community of foreign students, and then grew that to like where there was like 50 rooms at the time that I was managing.
Wow. And this is while you're in your 20s. Welcome to another episode of the Logger and Listings podcast. I'm your host, Kurt Warner. This week, I have the pleasure of having Terrie Schauer with us. Terrie is a mom, an ex-athlete. She also holds a Ph.D, which we'll dive into later during the episode. But more importantly, she's been a property manager for over half of her life. Being a property manager has allowed her to pursue her dreams in both her career and personal life. And I'll let Terrie tell you more about that when she dives in. So Terrie, welcome to Logger and Listings.
Thanks, Kurt.
So Terrie, you have a PhD. I know we were just chatting about that before we started. What is your PhD in, and why did you pursue it?
Well, I think the real question is, how did I get into real estate? Because I was on a certain path, basically, since I was a teenager, I decided I wanted to be a professor at university. So I basically studied, like, my PhD's in communications, because my topic happened to be in the communications department at Simon Fraser. But like, basically it's kind of philosophy and, media and how media then affects society. And my specific topic was criminal policy and portrayals of criminals and prisoners in the US. So has nothing to do with real estate. But the sort of silver lining is that if you a PhD or graduate studies in social sciences didn't take up all my time. And I always kind of had a sideline as a property manager and then, as an investor towards the end of my PhD. And when I came to the end of that, I had this fork in the road. Am I going to do real estate as my full-time thing, or am I going to work in academia? And the choice ended up being real estate. So
what made you decide to get into real estate in the first place, as far as managing properties and also investing?
So it really wasn't a decision. I moved out of my parents' house when I was 19. I went to study in Toronto, and there was no space left in student residence at U of T at the time. So I ended up living in actually campus co-op. I don't know if that's going to have any meaning for your listeners, but
only us old ones.
Sorry, yeah. So like this huge, like badly managed student house with 15 people. And when I moved in, there was like garbage piling up. It was super gross. There was no manager really doing anything. And the next day, my housemates voted me house manager after I cleaned up the garbage.
Awesome.
And so I just ended up falling into that and discovering that I kind of had a knack for it. And then after I moved out of that house, I, rented a big property with my dad co-signing the lease, and was like, I'm going to do this as house hacking before house hacking was cool. And then that turned into a first investment property. And then that was kind of how things got started.
So what were some of the early struggles that you had managing properties, especially talking about co-op housing, and then also that first property that you were house hacking?
Yeah. So my first real challenge once I took this step to becoming an investor is, so I moved back to Montreal and closed on a triplex in Hochelaga Maisonneuve, which is like, at the time was kind of like the worst, poorest district of Montreal. Mm-hmm. And my first challenge was finding tenants, because at that time, I think we were around like 4 or 5% vacancy in Montreal. So it was difficult to find tenants. And in that area, it would have been like a very difficult population. And so I did what I knew how to do, which was manage student housing. Mm-hmm. So I furnished the units and then rented them out by the room to foreign students who had just arrived in town. And because I'd had that experience as a student living away from home and understanding how having that community can really make the difference in how, you feel good about where you are and you're integrated, I kind of created that experience for people coming in from outside of Montreal. And that business model actually worked so well that it turned into like my early property management, because I had this way of optimizing buildings in a bad part of town, bringing in good tenants and renting for almost double market value, because I created this kind of community of foreign students, and then grew that to like when there was like 50 rooms at the time that I was
Wow.
managing.
Wow. And this is while you're in your 20s.
Yeah.
Awesome. So
Yeah.
was it difficult being that young? Because I know there's, young people out there that want to get into real estate, want to get into property management, but they feel that being so young and approaching investors that are, I'm not going to date you, but date myself, my age or older, they feel intimidated. So what was it like for you trying to approach, investors and saying, hey, I can manage your properties?
I think that actually like wasn't the most difficult part because like I said, I just happened that at that time in that particular market, like finding tenants and finding good tenants was a real challenge. I was in a bad neighborhood, and the people that I approached immediately saw the value of what I was selling. So I think even that I was young was okay. And I
Mhm.
think it was okay also because the kind of people who were working in that area, the other managers like reflected the population. And so because I had this kind of like natural affinity with, Anglophone or maybe from like property owners from France, there really wasn't anyone with that background working in Hochelaga at the time. So like that was kind of an easy shot. What was more difficult was actually like the management part, because if you can imagine like 50 college kids spread out across, I think it was like 6 or 7 properties at the time, like it was just
Wow.
really, really, you know, drunken parties and like breaking of stuff, and you know, dogs in the basement and like crazy, crazy stuff.
So were you doing this on your own, or did you get to a point where you had to hire other people to kind of help?
Yeah. So I had at the time, like as I ran it that business, I had like a kind of a right hand person who actually was always from the community. So I would hire within the community, and that person would be sort of like the welcome committee. We had like a little company scooter. They would go pick our new arrivals up at the metro station or at the airport, move them into their house, and then kind of like help me keep a lid on stuff.
Okay, awesome. So how long did you do that for as far as managing the student rentals in that part of Quebec?
Yeah. So, I mean, that lasted until I was about, I think, 34, 35. So, like almost 10 years. And then two things happened. First of all, I got a bit sick of dealing with the craziness because I think when you're in your mid 20s, like it was fun. I used to party with my tenants. And then at a certain point, that got kind of old.
Mhm.
And then also what happened is the market changed, and Hochelaga started, being more up and coming. Montreal in general started doing well, and like there really was not that spread anymore between the rents we could get for furnished units rented by the room and just units rented normally. And
Mhm.
so, like, I was at a point where I was ready to pivot into becoming more of a professional property manager, and at the same time, the model ceased being a real way to optimize properties, and so it just kind of happened naturally. Like I
Okay,
started
so
flipping within like I think a year or two. I had ended the by the room rental and like unfurnished the units and just flipped them all into normal rentals.
what did you pivot to when you were in your mid 30s?
Yeah, so that, I mean, pivoted my business into like more of a classical property management gig, I guess. And I also kind of became involved with the Real Estate Investors Club, and like I now coach for them and run their podcast. So the Real Estate Investors Club podcast in that focuses on the Montreal market. And what happened then is I started to realize how multi-residential properties are valued, and then I began to realize how much money I was making for my clients. Because I
Mhm.
think before, like I was just interested in, having a lifestyle where like I wasn't, tied to a job, and it kind of worked well for me. And then I realized like, wait, hang on a second, like by professionally managing these buildings, I'm making hundreds of thousands of dollars for my clients, and
Mhm.
they're mad when they have to write me a check at the end of the month for $300. But like I'm making them hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like, why am I doing this for other people when I should be doing it, in the form of joint ventures or for myself?
Mhm.
And then that's kind of those lights went on, and then it took me maybe 4 years to pivot more into like full-time investor. I still have a property management practice, but I'd say by now it's like of the units that I have, 70% I own, either myself or with partners, and then 30% are still outside, that I manage for other people.
Now, for the properties that you're either a joint venture on or that you do yourself, are they all in Quebec or are you in other provinces as well?
So it's all in Quebec. 50% of the portfolio is in Montreal. 50% is in Trois-Rivières, which is a submarket about an hour and a half outside of Montreal. And that all happened during COVID because Montreal became too expensive in terms of like the sort of cash flow ratios. And it became very difficult for my business model, which is, sort of low income, poorly managed properties. I look for properties that are poorly managed in the low income bracket. And, they cash flow immediately, but there's so many management headaches that it just takes a lot of it takes about 2 years to kind of get them running smoothly. And that
Mm-hmm.
business model just works now in Three Rivers better than in Montreal. So,
So I've always heard, like ever since started taking classes and learning about investing in real estate, there's certain people that say, stay away from Quebec. It's different out there. So what are some of the differences that, if you're an outside investor like myself in Ontario or other provinces looking to get into Quebec, what are some things that we need to know about?
yeah. So, I mean, I would say as a, in general investment strategy, like you need local partners because the legal environment is very specific. And then there's also French.
Mhm.
So, I would say 90% of my business takes place in French, even though most of the speaking and coaching that I do tends to be, Anglophone investors. But the actual on the ground stuff is all in French because my tenant base is pretty much Francophone.
Mhm.
So that's one thing. You need to have someone in your organization who is comfortable in French. And then there's just the legal environment. So like our tenancy laws are a bit different. Like we have moving day. So everyone in Quebec moves on July 1st.
Why
So our
is that?
whole so I actually researched this. I found it so weird. And it dates back to the time of the seigneuries, which is like, when this was a French colony, they were not allowed to turn their tenants off the land during winter.
Mhm.
And it had to do with the harvest season. And so it just happened that all Quebec leases are queued to end on July 1st. And so everyone, I think it's something like 80,000 people move in Montreal every July.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So the rest of the year, so people, like let's say somebody is out of province, for example, and is moving into Quebec. So I assume they're able to move in whenever if there's a vacancy. But if they want to move out, they have to wait until July 1st. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, well, so there's like a lease transfer system. So if you want to move into somewhere, let's say, January 1st or March 1st, because that's when you're coming in, you will probably be able to find a lease transfer because our leases are also fixed date. So you can't really move out in the middle of a lease, right? Like you're responsible from July 1st to June 30th. And if someone needs to move out during that time, they will advertise a lease transfer and then like the person can just assume the lease of the old tenant.
Okay.
So in practice, that's kind of how it works. And like, of course, there are people who don't move on July 1st, but if you do sign a lease, let's say in March, it will end on July 1st because all the owners here want to be on that calendar year because like, for example, now it's rent increase season. So like I'm doing my rent increases for all of my properties. We have a government form that we have to fill out that tells us how much we're allowed to increase. You're even supposed to do that in between tenants. So you're not really technically allowed to adjust your rents to market rate in between tenants. There are workarounds, but that's the law. And
Okay.
we don't have damage deposits.
Interesting.
So you can imagine what that looks like on July 1st when 80,000 people move out and they have no damage deposit.
That's when everybody goes on vacation, unless you're moving just to get out.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. So, what would you advise, like somebody looking from outside of the province? What are some of the benefits of investing in Quebec?
Mm-hmm. So the fact that we have these, I call them screens, right? Which kind of keep investors out because they don't want to deal with the French or they don't want to deal with this like tenant friendly climate. It means that, the type of ROI that you can find in Quebec and even in Montreal today, like forget it. Like we're nowhere near Toronto or Vancouver. We're whatever 10 years behind. And so it means that you can find pretty good deals here, especially if you're looking with out of province eyes, because our
Mhm.
properties are pretty cheap. And if you want to run an optimized game, like you can still make a fair amount of money by just putting your properties under good management. So I think there are opportunities for people out of province, and like some of my partners are either from out of province or out of the country, and
Mhm.
they've seen the interest in the local market. And Montreal also historically, like we're in the process of catching up right now with the rents that there are in Toronto and Vancouver. So I think over the next 10 years there's going to be like incredible rent growth here, although our property values are like, you know 30 to 50% of what you would pay for something in Toronto.
So when you're looking at like Three Rivers, for example, how much would you pay per unit for something that's going to cash flow well?
so our GRMs are something around like I want to say 13, 12, 13.
Okay.
And so like you buy something, it's going to cash flow immediately.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So do you have any plans of investing outside of Quebec, or you just kind of focus more in that market?
So yeah, it's a difficult question because I think as we all progress, we are aware of the importance of diversification, but it also happens that, I know things so well here that the opportunities, I see them, they kind of find me, like I have people who bring me deals sometimes, and it's a bit difficult for me to say no just because I have such a well-oiled machine here.
Mhm.
But I do have plans. I used to actually worked for 3 years in Marseille in France. So
Yes.
I'll have a project to buy maybe a unit or like a duplex there, and then with the podcast, I talk to so many people who are in the States, and it just seems like there are so many interesting opportunities there that like at some point I'm going to try to crack that nut, but I'm not sure that it's going to be in the next 6 months.
So what brought you over to France? Because you spent a little bit of time over there, didn't you?
Yeah, so this goes back into, I'm like a cat that's had 9 lives. This goes back to like a previous incarnation where I used to be a semi-professional kickboxer.
Oh,
Um, yeah, and so I had an opportunity to go box in France because so you can in Canada you can sort of fight amateur, and then there's like a pro national team level, but there's no real way to move in between those. And so like I kind of went to France to move up to the next level. So I spent 3 years boxing there in Marseille, and also decided like that was my first experience really full time doing real estate. So I finished my PhD and then got this opportunity to box in France. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go there. And my day job is going to be in a real estate company and a management company. And that's what I did there for 3 years.
so what was the difference managing properties over there versus over here? Like every market is different, like as we're talking about Quebec, but I'm sure there are even more differences when you go to, across the pond to another country.
Yeah. So, I mean, France, like it's, if, I guess the experience of the rest of Canada to Quebec is already, there's like a lot of red tape and government interference and stuff here. France is like where Quebec inspired itself from. So like they have 3 year leases. You really cannot terminate leases there. And so when we like you would have to analyze a file, it's like the same file you would put together when you get mortgage financing, right? Like we would
Mhm.
have these like thick files on people, and they have 3 months of damage deposits. And so then I used to have to do like move outs, and they're like, they're people make their apartments so spotless for fear that you should dock them like one hole of a nail that they put in somewhere. And then like you know Marseille also, it's about half like North African, it's half French, like or, whatever ethnic French, and half North African, and those populations don't really get along. So there was like a lot of racism and stuff that like I had trouble adjusting to, like as a Canadian who arrives there like with Care Bear eyes of like we treat everybody equally and we all love each other and get along. Like that's kind of not
Not the case over there.
not the case in France. Yeah.
So did you end up managing a lot of properties over there? And is that something that you continued after you came back, or did you kind of shut that business down?
Well, so it wasn't my business. I worked in a property management firm there, and it was this firm that had about 1,000 units under management, and it was this like family run, from father to son kind of thing that had
Mhm.
been in business for 150 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was like really that was also kind of a funny thing, like working in the European environment where like you don't just print 100 business cards and decide that you're a property manager there. Like it's much more sort of ossified. But it was a great experience because I got to deal with from what's called in France les cités, which are like their ghettos basically, where it's like these huge high rises where the tenants would like burn the kitchen cabinets because they didn't have money to pay for heating, and then you have to go in and like do move outs in there, and they throw the garbage out the window, and it's like this kind of crazy environment all the way to like high end, you know thousands of euros a month rentals. And so I really got to see this like crazy cross section within the city and deal with that. So it was really an interesting experience.
So, moving to today, where do you want to grow your business? Like you talked about, maybe investing in other provinces, possibly in the US, but let's look at maybe 5 years from now. Where do you see your business going to?
So like I've always been on kind of a conservative growth track, like I think some people like to go really fast. I've built my business slowly over, a 20-year time period. And so I like see myself continuing on the same trajectory, which is that before I get into joint ventures with people, I really take, a lot of time to vet that business relationship. I don't want to grow super fast and get into business with people that it's going to ultimately end in conflict.
Mhm.
And I'm pretty comfortable with, my current business model. So I think it's going to be to just, slowly continue to add, whatever 15, 20 doors a year and grow to the portfolio size that I want to get to and then kind of stop there. Um, I guess a lot of what I'm working on now is by being involved with the Real Estate Investors Club and growing the podcast is more to coach people and kind of give back by letting other people kind of learn from what it takes to become a professional investor. I guess like
Mhm.
once somebody's figured that out, there's like kind of a growth curve, certain number of predictable obstacles that you have to go through to if that's the lifestyle or that's the path you want to take. And so like for me, if I'm looking at growing something, it's really more kind of that aspect of what I'm doing, and the investing is just going to follow its its trajectory, let's say.
So, can you tell for listeners that don't know, can you tell us more about the Real Estate Investors Club?
Yeah, sure. So it's pretty much like the number one coaching organization in Quebec. It's specifically focused on offering training that's appropriate to the Quebec market. And so I've been running the podcast for the organization for about 2 years, which is like really cool. It's just like this, you get to have, interesting conversations with other people who are, at the top of the field. And we hold monthly networking events and things like that that can help people. And if I can just, do a little segue or a little bit of preaching about networking, I think one of the things that people struggle with when they get into real estate is they'll have whatever their old networks are and their old peer group, and one of the struggles that people have is how do you start to build this new network, this new group of people that's going to help mentor you, that you're going to do business with. And so, one of the things that we do is we really try to, make it easy for people to step into that world by being welcoming, by, organizing monthly meetups, and the podcast as well. Sometimes we have other investors like on the show to kind of demystify what it is.
Mhm.
Because I think like in the growth process, we all face similar challenges. And if you have that network of people around you that you can just kind of, dip into, there's nothing new under the sun. You just have to find the person who solved that problem before you.
No, absolutely. I think networking is something that a lot of new investors kind of take for granted, or they don't know how to network properly.
Yeah.
They'll
Yeah.
kind of show up and just kind of sit in the corner quietly by themselves, unless they're an extrovert, but not really get out there because they don't have, properties, they don't have experience. And, one thing I think that's very important, and you mentioned it, like all of us as investors start off with zero, and we're more than happy to help somebody, guide somebody to get them started if this is what they want to do. So for anybody listening, if you're going to attend networking events, talk to people. It helps.
Yeah.
We're friendly.
Yeah, but it's also not that. Like I think like I might not show now, but like I'm an introvert, and I like really really struggled with that networking aspect, in the beginning of my career. And I think what really opened my eyes is that when I realized like it's not a popularity contest. Like there's really a scientific method to how you can grow your network in like not a slimy effective way. And it's like, this is one of the things that we teach in the Real Estate Investors Club is how do you go about in a concerted, intentional way building your network
Mhm.
for the purposes of real estate investing. And like it's not rocket science, but there's a methodology to it. And if you apply that, it's going to work. And it's not that thing where you're going to, get there and who should I talk to? How should I introduce myself? No, it doesn't have to be like that. It can be super intentional. And, I won't get into too much details, but like even just mapping out what's a good connection for me. And when you build a network, it has to be like mutually beneficial. So who am I going to be able to benefit? Who's going to be able to benefit me? And if I have a structured way of focusing on how can I be of value and of service to the people in my network, immediately I'm going to be top of mind. right? And so like how do you create those relationships that are like intentional and like useful, profitable, meaningful? And then it's not about like, oh, like I'm the coolest, loudest person at the high school dance kind of thing.
No, no, that does not work.
Yeah.
So how can people find out more if they're looking at investing in Quebec and learning how to do it properly?
Yeah. So, I mean, really, the best thing is go check out the podcast. So, Real Estate Investors Club podcast, either on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. I also wrote a book called The Mindful Landlord.
Mhm.
So those are two like really low cost, low hanging fruit ways to get involved. And then come check out a monthly networking event. If you follow me on social media, you got my name at the bottom, Terrie Schauer. I have a newsletter. Whatever point of contact you pick, you're going to get updated on some of those events and some of the ways that you can get in touch. So that's really the best way.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that we leave links and everything in the description below. So make sure you click on those links. And is there anything you haven't done? So you've traveled the world, you've done kickboxing, you have a PhD, you manage properties, and you've written a book. And can you tell us a little bit more about the book and what it's about?
Yeah, sure. So it's called The Mindful Landlord because, one of the things that I learned over my career that struck me over my career is there tends to be this kind of like competitive ethos very often among investors where I call it the 3 Ds: more deals, more doors, more dollars. And that it becomes this kind of contest of who's got a bigger portfolio and who went further faster. And that, like, for me, bringing more mindfulness into it and considering what are your goals, what's going to bring you pleasure, what's your path going to be, and don't worry about what the people who are talking super loudly are about, right? So I think that's one aspect. The other aspect is also just being real about it. I think you don't get good at anything without taking lifestyle hits, not
Yeah.
in sports, not in relationships, not in investing. And so, by kind of getting real about some of that stuff and talking about the mental obstacles, because, I think if I compare it to diet, like everybody knows what they need to do to lose the 10 pounds, right? But the problem is up here.
Mhm.
And real estate investing is the same. There's so much information, free information, low cost information out there, that the problem really becomes not implementing the stuff that you should do. And that comes down to mental obstacles, which through the mindfulness process, you can sort of learn to overcome those things. But it's a question of mental training. It's not so much a question of, how many offers do I send out? How do I calculate my mortgage? Where do I find joint venture partners? Like, that stuff is tactics, right? Like really what it takes is to align yourself mentally with what your goals are. And that's a mental audit more than it is a what to write in the offer kind of question.
And I think you read my mind because I stepped on the scale this morning. I'm like, just 10 more pounds, 10 more. But that's awesome advice. And I definitely agree with that. And, for anybody that's listening, please make sure you click the links below. Follow the podcast. It is awesome. I've listened to a couple episodes. So definitely check that out. And Terrie, one last question for you. And I like to ask my guests, well, two questions, two-parter. As we're kind of in the beginning of 2023, I had a chance a few months ago to sit down with a good friend of mine that asked me this question. And she said, when we look back at 2022, what is one word that you would use to describe that year for you as from a business standpoint?
Volatile.
Okay. And as we look at 2023, what would you like this year to be? So if we had this same conversation a year from now and I asked you this question, what word would you want to be able to tell me?
That's a good question. I mean, I would say like stabilized. And I think that's also, like I think through COVID, we just had, whatever, almost 3 years of time when it was very difficult to make business decisions because we don't know which way things are going, right? Is it going up? Is it going down? What should I do? The interest rates, da da da. And I think that, adjusting to a volatile environment, you can't get around it. If you want to keep doing business today, you have to just be at peace with the fact that things are a moving target and a deal is a deal is a deal. It's February 7th, 2023. A deal that works today is going to look nothing like a deal that would have worked a year ago. But if the numbers make sense and if I can find capital to do it, look, it's a deal today. And if you make a 5-year plan based on a current mortgage rate and your current rate of return, what are you going to do? Sit on the sidelines for the next 5 years? Like, that is never the right answer. So you have to just be comfortable with uncertainty and say that, okay, like maybe this is not the best, the best deal. And no, it's not as good of a deal as it was 2 years ago. But if it makes sense under today's conditions, close on it, make sure it's not going to put you in the red, make sure you're very solid about your math, but close on it, sit down for 5 years. That's real estate investing.
Yes, it is. Well, Terrie, thank you very much for being on the Logger and Listings podcast. It was a pleasure getting to learn more about you, hear your story. And also I picked up a few tips for my business as well. So thank you for that as well. So for the listeners out there, again, as always, appreciate you for tuning in. And until the next episode, cheers. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Logger and Listings podcast. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to leave a like, comment, or even better yet, share it with other aspiring investors and entrepreneurs. Your support helps this podcast grow organically, and in turn, helps other investors and entrepreneurs grow their businesses and have fun along the way. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.